We often underestimate the power of fear. Fear makes our bodies and minds do things they don't normally do. When we are afraid, the amygdala, a little part of our brain, alerts our nervous system, which is what puts our body's fear response in motion. We release stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Our blood pressure goes up and our hearts start beating fast as blood moves away from our heart into our limbs so we can be ready to either fight or run for our lives if we have to. Isn't that amazing what the body can do? The not so amazing part is that at the same time our body is ramping up for the fight or flight, parts of our brain begin shutting down. When the amygdala senses fear, the cerebral cortex, which contains our judgment and our reason, shuts down, which makes it very difficult to think clearly or make good decisions. One of the reasons why guns in the hands of anyone is not a good idea. We read so many stories about people who fight back during robberies or try to hang on to their phones instead of handing them over. And I think experts would say their judgment was certainly clouded in that moment. Instead of flight, they choose fight, not understanding the life and death nature of fighting. Dr. Lance Williams teaches urban studies at Northeastern Illinois University and is an expert in street gangs and urban youth culture. In a presentation he gave to a group from the Presbyterian of Chicago who gathered at the First Presbyterian Church in Woodlawn to do some analysis of gun violence here in Chicago, he said he believes the primary issue fueling gun violence among young black men is fear. He said you'd never see the fear by looking at these youth because they do not ever want anyone to see their fear. But everything they are doing is in response to their fear. Dr. Williams told the Presbyterian group gathered he wanted us to be clear about what he's talking about related to gun violence in Chicago. He said 85% of the victims of gun violence and the perpetrators are occurring among a specific group of individuals, young African American men. He said we have to talk about it in that context. What's going on with these young people? He pointed out that the neighborhoods they live in share certain characteristics. They are predominantly African American. The poverty rate in each neighborhood is twice as high as it is in the rest of the city. While many of them have graduated from high school, unemployment is very high, and crime and violence are long-standing issues in each of the neighborhoods. There are 10 police beats in the city of Chicago with the highest rate of gun violence in the city. And then there are some concentrations of beats too, where beats cluster. He showed us a graphic of the 10 most violent beats, and then he showed us a graphic that talked about the numbers of Chicago public schools that were closed and whose buildings were not repurposed in any way. And you could almost put one map over the other with a direct correlation. The violence is not happening out of thin air. It wasn't just that one day the African American male youth decided to take up guns. When you live in an area where there is high poverty, high unemployment, empty buildings, few schools, and crime, you live in a constant state of fight or flight. And while some get out, those who can't stay to fight. In the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about Moses. We began with the collaboration of women whose actions saved his infant life. Moses ended up being adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the palace. He was a Hebrew by birth, and he grew up watching the enslavement of his people while he lived with the enslaver. Imagine what that would do to a person. In Exodus 2, we're told a story that begins with Moses as an adult. I told it earlier, where he goes out for a walk and sees the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, and then kills the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. Killing someone up close is not easy. And I've wondered what drove Moses to murder someone for the first time. Was it an entire lifetime of feeling like a stranger in the palace? Was it that he had been observing this horrible oppression of his people since he was a young child, living in fear that he too could be enslaved at any moment? Was it that he was one of the rare people who is driven to intervene no matter the consequences? We have heard Moses held up as a defender of the oppressed. Just last Sunday, Mariana highlighted that he protected this Hebrew man who was being beaten. And then he intervened with the two Hebrew men who were fighting, and then he ran off the shepherds who were trying to get in the way of the Midianite women. So he clearly has a sense of what's just and what's not, and can't help himself when it comes to intervening. This might be one place where I identify with Moses in a small way. I have intervened in many physical and verbal assaults without even giving it a second thought about the danger to myself. Apparently, my brain shuts off and my body decides to get involved. The same thing, I'm sure, was true for Moses, but unfortunately for Moses, it seems the word spread like wildfire that he had killed an Egyptian man. And so eventually the Pharaoh hears, and he tried to kill Moses, his adopted grandson. That's when Moses hit the road out of Egypt. And when he fled from Egypt, he settled in Midian with the 7 sisters and their father. One of the sisters is given as his wife, Zipporah. That's a pretty good reward for doing a good deed. You get a wife. He lived there with Zipporah, with Jethro, until the Pharaoh who tried to kill him died. And that's when God heard the cries of the Hebrew people and finally seemed to understand what they were enduring. So God's idea of how to connect with Moses and convince him to become a partner in the liberation of the entire population of Hebrew people is by setting a bush on fire and not letting it burn up. Moses was tending to the sheep and had wandered really far from the camp, and we're told was at the edge of the desert near Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. Moses saw the burning bush in the distance and made a decision to leave the well-worn path made by shepherds and sheep alike and walk over to the bush to see what was up. He wanted to know why it wasn't burning up. It's no small thing that he made the decision to leave the well-worn path. How often do any of us veer from our usual routine to notice what is awe-inspiring and miraculous, and maybe even a little terrifying? As he went over to the bush, God spoke to him, and the text says Moses was afraid to look at God, so he hid his face. God then tells Moses about the suffering of the people and told Moses to go to Egypt because Moses was the one who would bring the people out of bondage and into liberation. Last week in the sermon, we heard about Moses telling God that, nope, he really wasn't the right one to do it. Some scholars say that response, that conversation between Moses and God, actually lasted 7 days. Moses did not want to do it. Can you imagine keeping an argument going for 7 days? God finally got angry, and Moses agrees to do it under duress. But why was Moses so resistant? Even if he wasn't a good public speaker, very few people like to do public speaking, his kind of resistance was way deeper than his ability to speak or not speak. During the presentation that he gave us, Dr. Williams showed on maps the violent beats and the different gang factions. And he, because we were in Woodlawn, showed how the maps circle the edges of Hyde Park. But there's a bubble around the University of Chicago and the surrounding area. He asked, why do you think there's a protective bubble that exists around the University of Chicago? And some in the crowd said, maybe because the university has extra police. Dr. Williams explained that the University of Chicago has extreme wealth and actually has the second largest police force in the whole state of Illinois, despite the fact that there are only 14,000 students. He said they use the wealth to create a barrier that protects it from the outside neighborhoods. Recently, Hyde Park has seen some increases in violence. Dr. Williams pointed out that the University of Chicago has supported segregation and redlining, has definitely supported gentrification, and trying to get Black people out of the neighborhood to make a solid bubble. Now conditions have gotten so bad that it's beginning to seep in, because what's happening outside of the bubble is untenable. What's going to happen if it gets too out of control is that it's going to begin to damage and destroy the center of Hyde Park, and that will impact the university. He told us that in this neighborhood of Black people, there are only 200 to 300 Black students who are undergrads from Chicago attending the university out of 14,000. That's staggering. He talked about how Woodlawn, one of the closest neighbors to Hyde Park, was where the culture of shooting and killing was birthed. The street nickname where First Presbyterian Church is located is O Block, and it's where drill rap music was founded. Drill, the word drill, is used for a shooting. The music celebrates shooting and killing culture. One of the things that's changed is that in 2022, drill rap and all of the culture around it has become just a regular part of popular culture, and now killing is cool for teenagers. O Block has been the neighborhood for the Black Disciples, and STL is the St. Lawrence gang, and they both have rappers, and hundreds of kids have been killed in this rap music competition that is ongoing. It's been around for 60 years, though it keeps changing a bit. But the problem now is that it's popular and amusing in part because of social media. So what's happening? Dr. Williams pointed out that over the past 60 years, Woodlawn has gone from 72,000 black people to 18,000. That's a loss of more than 50,000 people. And that means a huge loss of human capital and support systems. He claims that the city and the university don't recognize that the lower that number gets, the more desperate people become, and that will mean the more violent they become. The city is just waiting for gentrification to wither the population, which we've seen all over the city of Chicago. But gentrification is not going to do it. The people will become more desperate, and the youth will stay in fight mode. In his book, The Liberating Path of the Hebrew Prophets Then and Now, Rabbi Nahum Ward-Lev has some theories about Moses based on centuries of Midrash. When it comes to why Moses was so resistant to partnering with God in the liberation of the Hebrew people, Ward-Lev says this: given Moses' history as a man who intervened on the side of the disadvantaged, Moses' protracted resistance is striking. What causes Moses to stand in such fervent opposition to God's will? Moses was concerned that neither he nor the people were prepared for the liberation journey. He doubted his ability to motivate the people, and he doubted the people's ability to hear the promise of liberation. For Moses, the people's inability to listen presented more than the immediate practical problem of needing the people's assent to undertake the Exodus. Moses understood that listening is the essential, irreplaceable practice for the liberation journey itself. Deep listening would connect the people to the movement of the prophetic stream. Moses believed that a people who could not listen could not be liberated. But that was not all. Ward-Lev went on to say that Moses' main problem was not his speech or his lack of motivational skills. His main problem was that he himself did not trust God. He did not trust that God's liberating power would be in any way sustainable. So if we picture in our minds God's liberating power as a stream that is constantly flowing through every and all generations, Moses was unable to jump in. We are told he led his people out of Egypt, but the journey was long and hard, and Moses did not trust God to have his back. I understand that completely. If God's deepest desire is for humanity to be co-creators in the liberation of potential for the human and not human world, how are we supposed to understand God's power? Moses has every right to be confused. God calls Moses to be God's partner in the liberation of the people, and yet God is going to use excessive power against the Egyptians. God calls Moses to be a partner, and yet God tells Moses only a part of the plan and not the whole plan. Just get them out of Egypt into the wilderness and wait for further instructions. Sure, because that sounds fun. Sure, the people are going to love me. God wants Moses to be partner and co-creator, and yet any relationship counselor will tell you God is giving mixed messages at best. But because I'm a middle child, I can also see God's side of it. The business of liberation is not easy and usually messy with so many winding roads. How do you convince someone, let alone an entire people, that they need to be liberated? That they are slaves to something that is not God and not good? The nature of humans is to choose what is familiar and comfortable over what is best and most liberating for all. 99% of humans would choose to stay in Egypt rather than go into a wilderness they do not know. Well, that's my guess. I didn't get that from any scientific place. How is God supposed to liberate the potential in the world when humans, us, when we are so afraid of what we do not know? Well, one thing is for sure. You don't wait until the people are ready, because they will be long dead before they are ready. And that's where it gets messy. One of the keys is that the partner God chooses, the prophet who will tell the truth, is one of the people. Someone chosen from among them, someone in their midst. But it has to be someone whose very strength comes from trusting that God is a reliable and trustworthy partner. And Moses just did not have that strength. And I could preach another sermon entirely on false prophets. But who are the prophets today that we are listening to? In our U.S. culture, with our well-worn paths of anti-Black racism, white supremacy, a racial wealth gap that is Grand Canyon-sized, and violence that is based on the fear of non-existence, who is speaking truth to us? Are there prophets speaking to all of us in our racial complexities, or does every racial group have their own prophets? I ask that question because the truth that I might need to hear as an out queer white woman pastor living in Chicago could be very different from the truth that a drill rapper living in Woodlawn who is still a teenager might need to hear. So when we gather as church and spiritual community across racial groups, who are our prophets? And for that matter, who is our God? I understand Moses not trusting God fully and using his own strength to try to get water from a rock. I am not an easy truster. I have a lot of difficulty trusting. And it's not clear to me how God works in the world other than through people. And sometimes the people that God is trying to work through say yes. And sometimes they argue for 7 days or 7 months or 7 years, refusing to do what God is asking. Sometimes I wonder if it's prophets we should be listening to at all. or if we're simply to join the work of the women, the midwives, the sisters, the mothers, the daughters of the pharaohs who are different from their parents. There's never a prophet, not ever, without the hard work all along that the women have been doing. One thing I know for sure out of this story, though, all of our liberation is tied up together, and that is part of the messiness. It won't matter if we work for human liberation if the planet burns up. It won't matter if we work for the liberation of the planet if humanity kills each other off. The fallacy of white liberation being all that matters has long been proven a lie, but it's still a lie that is being peddled. Anyone who says we have to be liberated from each other is not telling the truth. Our liberation is with each other. I don't know what that means politically, because I am stuck in the wilderness on that one. But I am willing to listen to people who can see beyond the wilderness of our political divide. And remember, listening, deep listening, is at the heart of this whole liberation story. Will we listen to the suffering, our own suffering and others' suffering? Will we listen to the prophets? Will we listen to the women who have been doing the work all along? Will we listen to God who is working God's hardest to make a way out of no way? Will we listen for our particular calling as a faith community? Listening is at the very heart of being and becoming liberated. Amen.